Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second meeting. We are going to wait probably one more minute for all the participants to enter. I'm Carlos Rivas. I'm part of Initiative Toronto, and I'm going to be moderating today. So I'm going to begin asking everybody to put their microphones on mute. And we have people from different parts of the world. Okay, I think we can start. So welcome everybody. For those who joined us after I briefly talked, I'm Carlos Rivas, part of Initiative Toronto, and welcome to our second seminar. I'm gonna be moderating, and to start, I'm gonna ask Ines Anderson to present our presenter today. Ines Anderson is the responsible for Initiative Toronto, and we'll say more about her and our presenter today. Ines.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. Well, thank you everyone for being here in the name of Initiative Toronto, linked to the new Lacanian School. This is the second seminar of a series of 3 online seminars on dreams. Last Saturday, Carlos presented the use of dreams in psychoanalysis from Freud to Lacan. Today, Jorge, thank you, Jorge, and welcome, will present psychoanalytic interpretation between the dream and the awakening. And next Saturday, I will present dreams in a testimony. Before presenting Jorge, I wanted to say, as many of you know already, that our Congress of the WAP 2020 was canceled because of the pandemic. Its theme was dreams, its interpretation and use in Lacanian treatment. Inspire this theme inspired us to do this series of 3 presentations. Carlos presented last Saturday, and then Jorge is presenting today. I want to cite to just read the words of Angelina Harari, our president, in the communication announcing the cancellation. Should that stop us from dreaming? No. The pandemic and the gravity that surround us won't deter the WAP, the World Association of Psychoanalysis. So the upcoming WAP Congress will be held in April 2022 in Paris. It will embrace discussions on the work produced for the Congress, which should have taken place in Buenos Aires, and will hence, the name will be Congress 1213. I am putting on the chat, I will put in the chat the link for wonderful material that was produced in preparation of the Congress. And the new theme of the Congress will be The Woman Doesn't Exist. And for sure, there will be activities on its preparation. So now, thank you, Jorge, for accepting our invitation. Jorge is a psychoanalyst, member of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, member of the Lacanian Orientation School in Argentina, PhD in semiotics, academic and teaching coordinator in the Master in Lacanian Psychoanalytic Theory of National University of Córdoba. And you will see that he's a wonderful teacher, professor on transmitting the psychoanalysis. Professor also in the master degree, well, a member of the Center for Clinical Research of Studies. He has published books, papers in Spanish, and I will put also some links and in English, and I will put some links so you can find some the text online. So Jorge, you have the floor.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, thank you.
Oh,
Okay,
something,
that,
Jorge, I don't know, say about the timing, no, that you want. Maybe we'll finish 10, 15 minutes earlier.
yeah, will be better. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you. I am aware of a work you have been doing for a long time. I remember one of the clinical study days in New York, I think 2 years before, when I met Ines Anderson. We could talk about the Lacanian orientation in Toronto. Not longer after that, we were celebrating the news of the creation of Initiative Toronto. As I said, it is a pleasure for me to share this activity with you. I would like to thank Ines Anderson, responsible for Initiative Toronto, for the invitation. I also thank Carlos Rivas, who is part of Initiative Toronto, and also thank some friends from different places who are here sharing this afternoon with us. Now, first of all, I am going to tell you the itinerary I suggest for today. This itinerary is organized in 4 parts. Firstly, I will try to locate the theoretical question that guides our clinical practice, that is, the difference between 2 categories of the unconscious in Lacan, the transferential unconscious and the real unconscious. And in a second part, I will analyze how the real unconscious leads Lacan to search a new perspective for the classical psychoanalytical interpretation. 3, elaborate on the importance of time in any analytical experience from a viewpoint that Jacques-Alain Miller called the 3 moments of an analysis. And at the end, like our point number 4, consider how relevant the interpretation of dreams is today in the analytical experience. So we had a long path, and I will begin with the first point. The Lacanian unconscious is a construction in transference. You know, there are 2 versions of the unconscious in Lacan, the transferential unconscious and the real unconscious. About the transferential unconscious, Lacan starts the mistaking of the subject supposed to know, which is from 1967, by asking himself, what is the unconscious? 5 pages later, he answers that all that is of the unconscious only plays on the effect of language. It is something that is said without the subject representing himself, nor saying himself in it, nor knowing what he says. Then Lacan adds, the order of indetermination constituted by the relation of the subject to a knowledge passing beyond him results, one can say, from our practice, which implies it insofar as it is interpretative. So, Lacan explains that the unconscious unfolds in the field of language, but that it exists because it is constructed thanks to our interpretative practice. We call this version of the unconscious transferential unconscious, not only because an analyst is needed for it to be constituted, as it is the analyst who does the interpreting, but also the other, that who structures language, the one of the transference, that is the other who is guarantor of what is said, because eventually that's where what is said refers us to. That's why Miller says that the transferential unconscious and the name of the father go hand in hand. As we can see, transference and interpretation articulated with each other to found the transferential unconscious, which will be the territory where analysis takes place. Now, although Lacan starts the text above with the question, what is the unconscious? Miller states that what truly guides Lacan in his work is the question, what is the real? And that there's nothing more natural than that question to a psychoanalyst. What is the real in the end? In the dimension of words, in everything that analysis carries, stories, anecdotes, lamentations, reproaches, approximations, vows, lies, regrets, sighs, words. What is there in all that? In the end, what is real? Well, until seminar 6, the real was the symbolic. It is the symbolic because what Lacan called the real at that time was excluding from analysis, and therefore what he isolated as the real in the cure, in the subject, is the symbolic nucleus. It is in seminar 7 that the real begins to take shape far from the symbolic and the imaginary. In his seminar, The Being and the One, Miller develops how, thanks Hegel, Lacan was able to arrive at a structured real, that of his early teaching, that of the structure unconscious as a language. But Miller says that makes no Lacanian sense unless it is understood that the unconscious is real. Then Lacan kept the real unconscious to himself. Miller adds, and only put it in writing in his last text, his preface to the English language edition of Seminar 11. Let's see what Lacan says in that text. When less du lapse, the space of a lapsus, no longer carries any meaning or interpretation, then only is one sure that one is in the unconscious. One knows. But one has only to be aware of the fact to find oneself outside it. There is no friendship there, in that space, that supports this unconscious. All I can do is tell the truth, says Lacan. No, that isn't so. I have missed it. There is no truth that, in passing through awareness, does not lie, but one runs after it all the same. This is then the real unconscious, which, as Miller states, makes a whole in Lacan's teaching, because it is against the notion of language, but it responds to a clinical evidence, and that's the one we learn in analysis that lasts until their conclusion. The evidence is that there is a limit to language, and access to it can only be gained after going through the transferential unconscious. So, our first conclusion is that both constructions, the transferential and the real and Lacanian unconscious need interpretation, transference, and time in order for them to occur. I will now specify some fundamental questions about interpretation and time in analysis. So we arrive to our second point, the Lacanian interpretation. In the text I mentioned above, the mistaking of the subject supposed to know, after Lacan labels psychoanalytic practice as interpretative, he adds a criticism to the way in which psychoanalysts sometimes use interpretations. He says, interpretation gives every satisfaction, above all to the psychoanalyst, who deploys in it the beatific moralism, which is to say, the one who covers himself up by only acting in any case for the good. And he concludes, thus the stones where his patient stumbles are no more than the cobbles of his good intentions. With these remarks, Lacan warns us that the psychoanalytic interpretation, at least in Lacanian psychoanalysis, has nothing to do with analysts who know about the unconscious of their patients before the unconscious is constructed in transference. That's why Miller says in his conference, there is a Miller conference, is an old conference in Buenos Aires called So Shh. It's like So Shh. No? It's about silence. That's why Miller says in his conference So Shh, that many times analytic theories of interpretation only bear witnessing to the narcissism of the analysts. When analysts think they know and interpret from that place, what they do is explain. And they usually do it thinking that it will be help their patients because they believe they know what their patients should know. And as they believe they know before their patients, they tell them, they inform them, they explain. That's why Lacan states the stones where his patient stumbles are no more than the cobbles of his good intentions. I was watching the new HBO series this week called Undoing. There, Nicole Kidman plays the role of a psychoanalyst who has just that position. She explains to the patients what happened. That is not the position of the Lacanian psychoanalyst. Lacanian interpretation does not concern itself with the good of patients. It is not an explanation, an unveiling, an indication, nor does it look for the meaning of the repressed story. What Lacanian interpretation seeks is, on the one hand, to allow the subject to elucidate his or her relationship with jouissance, and on the other hand, to move that relationship. In that respect, Lacan states the following in Talking to the Brick Walls, which is from 1971. I quote, "There is not a single analytic interpretation which does not exist to give to some proposition that is encountered its relation to a jouissance. To what does psychoanalysis mean? That it is speech that assures the dimension of truth to this relation of jouissance, and gain it remains no less assured that it can no in any way say it completely. It can only, as I put it, have say this relation and forge a semblance of it. These words explain how the analytic interpretation touches something of the construction insofar as it forges a representation around the relationship of the subject with jouissance. But such invention is the second part of interpretation, which the patient is in charge of. Certainly, it would not be possible without the analyst's action in the first part. Let me add an aside here to make it clear that, from a psychoanalytic standpoint, construction and interpretation are different. As interpretation aims at definite point, breaks the S1, S2, signifier 1, signifier 2, that relationship, opens a door to meaningless, etc. While construction brings together, articulates S1 and S2, producing a simulation of meaning just where we need the structure to understand the logic of the case. Now, there are different versions about what interpretation is throughout Lacan's work. I will take those in his late teaching, beginning with Seminar 17, which is not strictly part of his late teaching, but which provides an indication of it. In Seminar 17, Lacan presented the structure of interpretation as knowledge. That is, knowledge as truth, and as such, it can only be half said. So, he proposed two sides of the half said, the riddle and the quotation. Lacan says, a riddle picked out as far as possible in the texture of the psychoanalyzant's discourse, and that you, the interpreter, can in no way complete it by yourself. A quotation, on the other hand, sometimes taken in the same text, a particular statement. This can be taken as a confession if only you connect it up to the whole context. But here, in this case, you are appealing to whoever is its author. Lacan also notes the structure of the half said in another figure, the oracle. And in 1973, he states, I quote, the oracle that it neither reveals nor hides, it makes a sign. In this regard, Miller says, the oracle, as a way of saying, consists above all in giving no explanations. Explaining is unfolding, and the oracle is something folded. That constitutes the oracular, a new emergence producing an unprecedented effect of truth, an unprecedented effect of meaning. For that very reason, unfailing, since the place of its verification is empty. From L'étourdi onwards, the have said is displaced by the notion of equivocation. Lacan explains that the unconscious, by being structured like a language, namely la langue that it inhabits, is subjected to the equivocation by which each is distinguished. One tongue among other is nothing more than the integral of the equivocations that its history has allowed to persist in it. When Lacan finally abandons the idea of the truth, that exists one truth, he also abandons the hope that the effects of truth emerging from language will liberate from the symptom. Instead, he devotes his full attention to the effects of the equivocation emerging from la langue. That's why in his book, The Reverse of Biopolitics, Eric Laurent states, Lacan no longer speaks of the effects of truth that liberate from the symptom, but of the effects of equivocation that operate. This is the reason why in L'Étourdi, Lacan proposes thinking about interpretation by way of equivocation. And he says, I quote, nothing operates therefore except from signifying equivocation. As Miller explains, this perspective proposes an interpretation that, I quote, is not made up of the contents, the statements, but that it is a method of saying characterized by its ludic essence, and that it implies redirecting language, which is a regulation, to the possible games of language. In fact, its model is the funny, witty remarks, the wits, that wits which, according to Lacan, allows us to go through the door beyond which there is nothing else to find. But there's one more turn. In Seminar 23, precisely when Lacan was speaking about interpretation by way of equivocation, he added a new element and said, there must be something in the signifier that resonates. So Lacan goes from reason to resonance, from what one thinks to what one feels in the body. That is, the body is added. And so the quotations goes on as follows. But for this speech to resonate, for it to be consonant with, to use another word of the symptom, the body must be sensitive to it. Okay, let's recap then. Interpretation will take different forms throughout Lacan's work. The riddle, the quotation, the oracle, the equivocation. How can we think about each in clinical practice? Let's see an example. In 1967, Eric Laurent consulted Lacan. In the book, Do You Know Lacan? Laurent recounts that meeting. He starts as follows, I quote, in the preliminary interviews, I presented Lacan with all that farrago, asking him, above all, not to take me into analysis because I was too lost, too young, and too privileged compared to others who could not ask for analysis. Lacan concluded those interviews assuring me that my age, and the fact that I was lost were perfect to start an analysis, and that as far as privilege was concerned, I had no idea what I was saying. He added a phrase whose harmonics still resonates and whose multiple meanings have gradually been cleared. Today, I will describe it as follows. You always end up becoming a character in the novel that is your own life. For that, analysis is not necessary. What it does is comparable to the relationship between the story and a novel. The contraction of the time allowed by the story produces stylistic effects. Psychoanalysis will allow you to discover stylistic effects that may be interesting to you. End of the quotation. We could say that here we find traces of each of the forms interpretations takes throughout Lacan's lay teaching. Firstly, we find a trace of interpretation by way of equivocation, since the same reasons that the analysand assumes as a contraindication for his treatment are transformed by Lacan as favorable conditions to take him into analysis. I quote, Lacan concluded those interviews assuring me that my age was perfect to start an analysis. Secondly, the quotation actually appears when Lacan resorts to the signifier too privileged, but Lacan redoubles the bet by adding an enigmatic formula to the analysand's words, warning him that he has no idea what he is saying. And finally, the interpretation takes an oracular tone when Lacan tells him at the end, psychoanalysis will allow you to discover a stylistic effect that may be interesting to you. But we can say that this version of Lacanian interpretation expressly includes no more elements, the body. I will take two examples of this matter. We find the first one in the same article where Laurent recounts his analysis. I quote, Lacan cuts the session and walks with me to the door. His look is incredible, theatrically bad. His mouth is open, but he doesn't say a word. I told myself that I was going to be eaten raw, although I didn't have the slightest idea why. Once I was outside, I walked into a bakery without realizing it and asked for a certain kind of cake, making a welcome slip of the tongue that helped me see the chain of causes that had led me to feel like eating cake. The following day, when I was thanking him for that psychoanalysis lesson about the ways of making oneself be eaten, I confided to Lacan that I would like to do the same with my own patients. Oh, he said as he slowly walked to the door with me. You need a lot of experience for that. Okay, that was the first example. The second example is one that can be found in the movie An Appointment with Lacan. I am not sure whether it was shown in Canada, but I asked to Carlos if he could get the fragment that I need to share with you. Carlos, whenever you want.
Oh. Give me a second to put it in full screen.
No problem. If you prefer, I can continue talk and then you let me know when you are ready.
Okay, I think it's gonna be better if I don't maximize it. I don't know what is happening. But let's do it this way. Okay. Can you hear it?
There is no sound.
Yeah.
She's speaking in French, no?
Yes, she's speaking French, but
so maybe we can see we can read the
yeah,
subtitles.
yeah, we can read it. The most important is the subtitles.
Do I see it again?
One more time, yeah. Thank you. Okay. An Appointment with Lacan, it's a documentary film by Gerard Miller where some of Lacan's patients are interviewed where they remembered their analysis with Lacan. Susan Omel, now a psychoanalyst in Paris and one of Lacan's patients then, says, what do you see? One day in a session, I was talking about a dream I had. I wake up at 5 o'clock every morning. Then she adds, at 5 o'clock, the Gestapo came to get the Jews in their homes. Lacan leaped up from his chair and came to me. He gently stroked my cheek. I understood Gestapo. This second example is also useful to explain didactically what we mean by interpretation by way of equivocation. Let's remember what we mentioned earlier. Lacan explains in L'Étourdi that since the unconscious is structured as a language, it is also sensitive to the effect of this, which Lacan calls la langue. La langue in French, la langue altogether with no space in between, precisely to make it clear that it is use of the language, but without its grammar rules. Lacan says, I quote, one tongue among others, is nothing more than the integral of the equivocation that its history has allowed to persist in it. This means that in our own correct way of speaking, that is, in what we have learned as the right way of saying things properly, according to semantics and linguistics and grammatical rules and provisions, there are imprecise resonances inhabiting them. The sounds we have heard, those leftovers of sense, alternate meanings that the words we know have been gaining at different times, the confusion caused by words that sound the same to the ear but that mean differently, and so on. So then, on the one hand, we have the on the one hand, we have the language that follows the rule of grammar, and on the other, we have la langue. Which is this universe of meaning and sounds that go through language and that inhabit us since the moment we are born. This, that even if it is not our conscious level of awareness when we talked, it is always present underneath the language. These resonances are precisely the foundation of the art of comedy, and which Freud's book Joke and their relation to the unconscious clearly shows. However, in the field of language, what we always have is the signifier 1 and signifier 2. This articulation S1, S2. This means that one signifier S1 has meaning in association with another signifier S2. Its articulation of two signifiers what makes sense out of something. This is the articulation of signifiers that is being produced what the subject learned through his or her life experiences, his or her surrounding culture and historical period, for example. Once this articulation S1, S2 is produced, this meaning becomes unconscious, automatic. It works without the subject's knowing it's operating. That's how Susan O'Mell experienced the night. For her, the night was the hour of the Gestapo, and Gestapo was a referent to the horror of Nazism. When the night came, she was not aware that she was entering deep into the horror. That's why she couldn't sleep peacefully. However, if the analyst's intervention had been an explanation to the patient, if, for example, Lacan had said, "You cannot sleep peacefully because for you the night is connected to your childhood and the suffering in the horror of Nazism," he would have only threatened this S1, S2 bond. It would have given it even more consistency. The Lacanian analytical interpretation, by contrast, aims at breaking this articulation. The articulation a subject has produced in his or her own use of the language and which has been engraved, affixed in him or her. Analytical interpretation seeks to separate S1 from S2 so that the subject can realize that the meaning of things is not something fixed, universal, or eternal. Analysts use different techniques to free a subject from a meaning that has been torturing his or her life and which they thought was the only possible one. We cut the session, we use the enigma, a quotation. At the end of his teachings, Lacan says that one of the best options to accomplish this is by way of equivocation. Susan O'Mell's example shows formidable disinterpretation by way of an homophonic equivocation. And which is the effect? Susan explains this. That surprise, it did not diminish the pain, but it did transform it. 40 years later, when I tell you about that gesture, I can still feel it on my cheek. Susan did not forget the horror of Nazism. It is not that magically the word Gestapo did not mean Nazi police any longer, or that it changed its historical meaning. It means that now, after this unforgettable intervention of Lacan, every time Susan hears or pronounces the word Gestapo, she does not only remember the Nazi police, but what comes to her mind also is that gesture of Lacan on her skin. In this way, the S1, S2 articulation, Gestapo, Nazi, became weaker because this S1, Gestapo, now refers also to another S2, caress. Therefore, it does not have the same effect of meaning. That was Lacan's purpose when developing his theory of interpretation by way of equivocation in L'Étourdi. To make use of la langue, where there are no grammar rules, to use this place that can become a playground for sounds, where words can be forced, dismantled, or combined with no logic so they can produce effects, they can break the meaning produced by the rules of the language. In his last seminar, Miller will say that L'étourdi is precisely Lacan's latest great text, and that it is about a theory of interpretation. In fact, later, Lacan will suggest other formulas for interpretation, such as the Chinese poetry or the ejaculation. But these formulas still keep the logic of the interpretation by way of equivocation. Now I have a question for Inés or for Carlos. You say, we said in Spanish, jaculación. You said ejaculation or utterance?
That's a good question. I think it's ejaculation.
Okay, great. I will say ejaculation. Okay, for example, in seminar 24 in 1977, Lacan gives the example of the Chinese poetic writing and says, you will see that these forcings by which a psychoanalyst can make something else ring out something other than sense for sense is what resonates with the help of the signifier. But what resonates does not go very far, it is rather flabby. Sense deadens things, but with the help of what one can call poetic writing, you can get the dimension of what one could call analytic interpretation. Metaphor and metonymy have an import for interpretation only insofar as they are capable of functioning as something else. And this other thing that they function as is indeed that by which sounds and sense are closely united. It is in as such as a correct interpretation extinguishes a symptom, that the truth is specified as being poetic. It is not from the angle of articulated logic. And the first thing would be to extinguish the notion of the beautiful. We have nothing beautiful to say. A different resonance is at stake, one founded on the witticism. A witticism is not beautiful. It depends only on an equivocation. We see that the notion of equivocation is back again in seminar 24. The final purpose is to lead the subject to the limit of meaning, which allows them to encounter the shortfall of language in order to capture the real. What would that be? The encounter with the real unconscious for a fleeting moment. Let's remember how Lacan described this in his text. Remember, when lisp du lapse, the space of a lapsus no longer carries any meaning or interpretation, then only is one sure that one is in the unconscious. That is, when we stretch the limit of the S1, S2 articulation and show its contingency, the randomness of its value, the subject can finally capture something of the real. That there is no sexual relationship, and because of that, everyone needs to invent their own way of bonding with the other. Eric Laurent By the way, in his conference during the Congress of the World Association of Psychoanalysis in Barcelona in 2018, states that Lacan places in Seminar 22 the effectiveness of interpretation by way of the ejaculation. Laurent says, what in Seminar 22 is called ejaculation, this that indicates a real effect of meaning, becomes the new signifier in Seminar 24. And Miller, referring to this, explains, I quote, when we call a new signifier as new, we are in fact referring to a signifier that may have different use. A signifier that may be new, not just because it could have an extra signifier, but because instead of being polluted by the dream, this new signifier would trigger an awakening. As you can see, here we have the topic of awakening, but I will go back to it later. Before that, I would like to say that this itinerary we are following today is a tour throughout Lacan's work, and what I am trying to show is not a way of surpassing, but of integrating his works. It does not mean that we leave the transferential unconscious behind, and we now change it by the real unconscious, or that interpretation by way of equivocation leaves aside the quote, the enigma, the session cuts that Lacan teaches in the direction of the treatment in 1958. These perspectives include and add the previous ones, his different conceptual and clinical tools. They are not excluded. Another issue that is important to place is the question of time. The fact that an analysis is not only made of the analysand's discourse plus the analyst's intervention, it is made of time. Lacan is warning Eric Laurent about something related to this in the example I mentioned before. Eric tells Lacan that he would like to make intervention as the ones Lacan did. And Lacan answers, you need a lot of experience for that. Lacan is referring to time, not in terms of age, but in terms of time of formation. That is, you may be 80 years old and have a poor formation. It is not about the age of the practitioner, but about the quality of the time they have invested in their formation. Now, the effect of an interpretation also takes time. That's why I would like to remember what Lacan said in Seminar 13, The Object of Psychoanalysis, in 1966. When he brings back the topic of the Zen master. He says, I quote, everyone knows that Zen exercise has nothing to do, even though people do not know very well what that means, with the subjective realization of a void. And we are not forcing things in admitting that anyone, the average contemplative, will see this figure, will say to himself that there is no something like a sort of high point which should have some relationship with the mental void, that it is a matter of obtaining, and that this singular high point will be obtained in an abruptness, succeeding a weight which is something realized by a word, a sentence, ejaculation, even a rudeness, a kick in the backside. It is quite certain that this kind of pantalooneries or clowning have no sense except with respect to a long subjective preparation. I stress the fact that Lacan says a long preparation, a long subjective preparation. What he means is that if we tell a patient, gestapo, for example, we are not going to change their life suddenly, but that we need to work in analysis for a while before an interpretation has an effect. For that, in another text in Radiophonie, I don't know how it's translated in English. In Radiophonie, Lacan says, for the being, it takes time to make itself be. And this is a central indication in psychoanalysis. And that's why I chose the question of time as the third point of my lecture. I called this third point, an analysis is construction time. Chose de finesse and psychanalyse was a seminar that Jacques-Alain Miller started teaching in 2008. It was published in Spanish as Sutilezas Analíticas, in English, Analytic Subtleties. In this seminar, Miller states that a pure analysis, that is, one carried out until its end, might be divided into 3 moments or periods. Each of these is characterized by a set of conditions that provide it with a distinct functioning. That's why there are three modes of analysis: beginning analysis, ongoing analysis, and ending analysis. Earlier on, in his seminar Donc, Miller had considered the question of the 3 moments in an analysis. Here, he held that there was no matheme for the intermediate period, since a formalization of the level of accuracy available for the other 2 periods had not been developed yet. However, in Analytic Subtleties, the author tries to specify certain coordinates of that intermediate period more accurately. And the result of such attempt is his suggestion that the key moment for the direction of the treatment is precisely this intermediate period of an analysis. Okay, let's see. The first period of an analysis, when analysis begins, is full of events. There are discoveries, disclosures, crossings. That which was implicit becomes explicit, but in turn undergoes a radical transformation. It is formalized. Its logical consequences produce the first therapeutic reliefs. Therefore, transference is usually in its more positive aspect. Miller says, beginning analysis is the best part. It is the analyst's pleasure, the analysand's pleasures. Americans call it the honeymoon. Oh, How wonderful it would be if we could only begin analysis. It would be fantastic. As there are subjective disclosures in this first moment, it can be easily recognized that the opposition between the conscious and the unconscious is in the foreground. But Miller explains that this is not the same in an ongoing analysis. That is, the one which goes beyond the first interviews. An ongoing analysis reaches the intermediate periods, and at that moment, the main opposition is not so much conscious-unconscious, but rather that of the unconscious as knowledge and as reasons. This means that at the beginning of analysis, everything that the subject says on the conscious plane starts to take shape and reveal an unconscious logic. This construction allows the subject to find knowledge in the formalization of their discourse, in the serial arrangement of memories, in the localization of certain S1 that configure the formulas of their choices, etc. This produces a feeling of well-being that the subject credits as a gain. But as the analysis advances, the patient's discourse decreases and is organized around that which insists. It insists despite the conquered knowledge, and that which insists is resents. That's why Miller says, when he refers to the intermediate period of an analysis, that, I quote, the main opposition is rather that of the unconscious as knowledge and as resents. At this point, we have reached another moment in analysis, different from the first. We are in the second period, the one we call intermediate. Unlike the first, the intermediate period has slowly therapeutic effects. Disclosures become scarcer. They even stop, and repetition appears instead. Miller explains that it is no longer the repetition of traceable elements, those which produce a disclosures when arranged in a series. On the contrary, as Miller states, it is repetition in stagnation. Certainly, an ongoing analysis calls for crossing the stagnation, bearing it, that is, exploring the limits. It is, if you will, this quotation is from Miller, what I used to call the experience of the real according to the modality of inertia. Miller notes that in ongoing analysis, of course, there are disclosures, but what is actually expected, both the analysand and the analyst expected, is something of the order of untamed libido. As we can see, we are no longer in the realm of a gain of knowledge with the surplus resents, which is entailed by that and which is experienced as a feeling of a well-being. Instead, we are in the realm of the loss of resents. Specifically, the intermediate period of an analysis is about promoting the withdrawal of libido from those elements that were isolated and formalized in the moment of disclosures of a beginning analysis. Because of this, Miller states that in an ongoing analysis, the concerning issue is not so much that of a time to understand, but that of a time to disinvest. We focus on the withdrawal of libido. We are only satisfied by disclosures that lead us as such to that place. Therefore, if the predominant question of the first period of analysis, that of the beginning, is what does that mean? In the case of an ongoing analysis, that question is replaced. The analyst intervenes to facilitate the process that gives rise to a new question. What does that satisfy? How does it provide satisfaction? So if Miller spoke of the honeymoon when referring to the first period of analysis, the second period is about something else. I quote, struggling with analysis as it goes on is another thing. I told myself in my reflections, I can bear it, but the thing is knowing how. Without a doubt, with the burden of the reproaches it may result in, you are not doing anything to get me out of that place. Sometimes that's the reason why someone wants to change analysts. They get tired of the truth obtained. They go to someone else thinking their truth will be changed. This is the reason why we said earlier that the intermediate period of an analysis is a key moment, because that's when analysants reproach analysts for their malaise. Sometimes they claim to have a feeling of stagnation. They stress their perfect attendance throughout the years. They try to impose their feeling of urgency, and that's how negative transference is triggered. If analysts act on the urgency demanded by analysants, they end up letting themselves be fooled by the therapeutic preoccupations instead of leading the analytic experience towards its radical point, the end. Now, it is important for me to stress that the analysant is also responsible for crossing the rough time of the intermediate period of an analysis. Some testimonies of the past are clear in this regard. I will use two examples. But please let me close the window because the noises are very heavy. Okay. Two examples. The first example is the testimony of Jerome Lascaux. He said, at the end of the treatment, I wanted to change analysts and I discovered that I couldn't. It was a symptomatic loyalty that produced the loyalty to my mother. I couldn't break up. Whatever I said, whatever I did, the elucidation of the fundamental fantasy, being the other's pillar, he cannot do without me, allowed me to live. But then I thought, why live? My work goes on, and the analysis is not an obstacle. Living would have been to continue believing that words can do it all. So staying allowed me to break up, having experienced the emptying of the object, becoming aware of the lack of signifier in the other allowed me to set the chiasma of the past in motion. Another example can be found in the text Analytic Subtleties. Miller invites an analyst of the school, Bernard Seneaf, to talk about the third moment of an analysis, the end. Seneaf situates his analysis as a process between two interpretations. The first interpretation is at the very beginning of the analysis. I quote, "As I was leaving my analyst's office, he looked me straight in the eyes and asked me, 'What's that, the scar on your cheek?' I answered, 'Oh, it's nothing, a skin cyst that was removed.' He spoke slowly as he told me, 'You should have talked to me about that.' From the moment the analyst looked me straight in the eyes, the trace of the drive of the object gaze would begin to unfold. This trace would be closed 23 years later in the same way. Later on, Seneaf locates the second interpretation and says, interpretation number 2 arrived after a long analytic convolution, as the analyst cut the session and when we were about to separate, sitting on his chair, peacefully held me a while longer and, looking me straight in the eyes, he told me, 'You love your fundamental fantasies too much.' This sentence caused a subjective earthquake without my understanding anything. The analyst had touched a jouissance that I myself ignored. In this second example, we can clearly see how the object gaze condenses all the subject's jouissance. But we can notice that time was necessary. It took 23 years of analytic convolution, the patient says. The analyst's simple intervention when he said, 'You love your fundamental fantasy too much,' made it possible for the subject to untie that jouissance. That's what the analyst waiting for throughout the intermediate period of the analysis. So we could say that the second period of an analysis is essentially about the period of libidinal disinvest. It isn't the simplest one. It takes time, but it is the necessary condition for the end to be possible. It is only by going through this intermediate period of an analysis, sustained by both the analysans and the analyst's desire that it will be possible to create the condition for a pure analysis to occur. Finally, once the intermediate period of an analysis has been crossed, the end arrives. Transference and interpretation are disarticulated. They fall because there is no more meaning to deconstruct. So the past would be the road which goes from the transferential unconscious to the real unconscious. Miller says, I quote, "This moment, which Lacan called past, is the way out of the transferential unconscious. It's a moment when the relationship with the psychoanalyst, the companion analyst, is transformed. It's about liquidation. That's the moment when the function of the lesp du lapse is most clearly inscribed. The function in which the lapsus, a formation of the unconscious, no longer has any scope of meaning or interpretation. We can then speak of the way out of the transferential unconscious. So, in his seminar Le Tout Dernier Lacan, the very latest Lacan, Miller resorts to the expression the reverse of the past to explain that Lacan imagined proposing a new way which consisted in establishing a relationship between the real unconscious and the analytic cause. He outlines it in a way that is always oriented as the past vis. This goes in the opposite direction as it goes from the real unconscious to the transferential unconscious. The past vis is a transference with the analysis and therefore is the reverse of the past. Fine. Now that we have placed the question of time in the analytic practice during the experience of an analysis and its articulation with interpretation, I will address to the last point in my presentation, the relationship between interpretation, the dream, and the awakening. I thought this part of the text like putting up in like an update of the interpretation of dreams in psychoanalysis. That, like Ines told you, we have in the World Association of Psychoanalysis, we have international congresses every 2 years, and the theme of the canceled Congress was Dream, its interpretation and use. So we was working about it on that subject for a long time. Let's start from the beginning. The interpretation of dreams in Freud's most corrected and most updated text. Freud himself stated that the essential of his book were ready in 1896. But after the book was published, Freud felt a deep disappointment because only 351 copies were sold in the first 6 years. However, Freud always knew the real value of this work, so much so that in 1931, in the preface of the third English edition, he says, "This book, with the new contribution to psychology, which surprised the world when it was published, remains essentially unaltered. It contains, even according to my present-day judgment, the most valuable of all the discoveries it has been my good fortune to make. Insight such as this falls to once a lot, but once in a lifetime. Well then, in his previous work for the Congress, Eric Laurent states, the Congresses of the World Association of Psychoanalysis are decisive moments for the realization of a community of work between schools. They are always a way of effecting a return to Freud and at the same time of affirming our heresy in relation to Freud. The Lacanian heresy has initiated a radical renewal of Freudian practice, and this impetus must always be deepened. Laurent explained that Lacan proposes an anti-Freudian approach to the dream. I quote Lacan, I have every right, like Freud, to share my dreams with you. And like Freud dreams, they are not inspired by the desire to sleep. It's rather the desire to wake up that stirs me. This phrase by Lacan is from his text, The Third, and it deserves our full attention because it brings us back to the difference between the transferential and the real unconscious, to the issue of interpretation, and this includes the perspective of time. Let's see. In the review with interpolation of the seminar on ethics, Lacan explains that the dream itself is an interpretation of the unconscious, because meaning is created in its construction. Lacan calls this meaning that is constructed by the dream itself wild interpretation, as opposed to the reasoned interpretation, which is the one made by the analyst from what the patient tells him about the dream. For Lacan, this interpretation, the one made by the analyst, does not strengthen the construction of meaning that is already made in the narrative of the dream. This interpretation should help to conjure up the fault that the narrative is showing. That is, to locate a point where the articulation S1, S2 constructed by the dream can be broken. This orientation from Lacan regarding interpretation is from the early 60s, and it is somehow sustained all along the way till his latest teaching. He even stated in Seminar 24, I quote, I am trying to introduce something which goes farther than the unconscious. Now we could add something which goes farther than the transferential unconscious. Because what Lacan is trying to place is an entry point to the real unconscious, so as to find an exit to the spiral of sense. So, the endless spiral of meaning would be the way of the dream. While we sleep, the unconscious constructs sense, and more sense, and still more sense. This is precisely why we sleep. In this context, awakening would be open a hole in meaning to find something of the real. However, every time Lacan talks about awakening, he explained that an absolute awakening is impossible because we live in the universe of sense, which is created by language. and we are trapped in this world. There is no escape from it. But there are moments when it is possible to catch a glimpse of the real unconscious, provided it is only a glimpse. That's why Lacan says in the text I mentioned earlier regarding the real unconscious in his preface to the English edition of Seminar 11, I quote, "But one has only to be aware of the fact to find oneself outside it." All right then, following the same perspective in his seminar on the logic of the fantasy unpublished, Lacan acknowledges that even though there is no such thing as an absolute awakening, there are glimpses of awakening. Those glimpses are the signs of the real that Lacan explains, first in Seminar 11, when he links them to the hidden reality at the level of the drive. Then in Seminar 17, Lacan says, a dream wakes you up just at the moment at which it might reveal the truth. And also in Seminar 20, I quote, when something happens in their dreams that threatens to cross over into the real, it distresses them so much that they immediately awaken. As we can see, while Freud focused on the interpretation of dreams to show that the unconscious has meaning and it is expressed in its formation through language, so he tried a fragment by fragment interpretation of the dream as if it were a translation exercise that built the transferential unconscious. Lacan takes the topic of the dream a step further. It is not that he ignores the value of the classic interpretation. He just takes it a step further. That's why Eric Laurent states, I quote, we must first make use of it in order, I read it again. We must first make use of it in order to finally do without it. We will have to first decipher the dreams. We will have to traverse the orgies of interpretations of meaning to accompany the analysand, authorizing him to unplug all the possible associations to a dream in order to finally come in a second time, once meaning has been made use of and used well, to a point outside of meaning. Therefore, the classic interpretation does not disappear, whether it is used as an invitation to construct a transferential unconscious or to encourage the belief that the unconscious exists or to facilitate the establishment of a transference or to untie moments of subjective impasses. In any case, the work of coding and decoding the unconscious is still an essential tool in the direction of the treatment. However, Lacan warns that if we don't go a step further, we would be making a mistake, because then analysis would become an endless process. That's why Miller says, this is not what Lacan calls the way of a true awakening for the subject. What do these last words mean? I will read you what Miller states in his text published in the Silicet collection on the occasion of the cancelled Congress. The main fact of any discourse is that it makes us fall asleep. This also applies to the analyst when he or she abandons himself or herself to the listening of the patient. There is a slope in the analysis. There has been for a long time that leads each of the partner of the couple to fall asleep together. We need to be aware that usually a psychoanalysis satisfies the desire to sleep of a subject irritated by the real of his or her symptom. The hubbub, the free associations, the narration of dreams, the lapsus, the memories, they can all be the trap. The exact point where they are included in a circular discourse that does not go beyond the interpretation of meaning. Because meaning is interminable. There can always be a bit more. I can always say a bit more. This is exactly why Lacan introduces the device of the short session, reframes the theory on interpretation, to seek an interpretation that, instead of adding sense, can interrupt meaning, take out some sense, and allow the appearance of the real that doesn't stop not being written. Then Miller wonders what would be the interpretation that points to an awakening, and he finds the nightmare. I quote, "The awakening that takes place during the nightmare. When we find something we don't like, the horror, something we don't want to know anything about, except that we want it to disappear." In this sense, Miller states, an analyst interpretation that is efficient is a nightmare. But it is a type of nightmare we can't run away from by getting into the fantasy of the world. Then Miller adds a very interesting clinical factor, which is perfectly verifiable in the clinic, in our own analysis, and in the testimonies of the past we usually hear. There is a correlation of this in our experience. The progress of the treatment is noticeable by a specific evidence. That is, when the dream can extend itself beyond the point of anxiety that was its very limit before. Once we place the parallelism between nightmare and interpretation, it is interesting to become aware of the necessity to go beyond the point of anxiety so that it doesn't work as an escape. This is when the famous credit from Lacan to Freud comes to the picture, when he says that Freud is a tough customer because he could go beyond the horrific images of the Irma's throat. Remember the paradigmatic dreams in the interpretation of dream. At a certain point in the dream, Freud looks into the Irma's throat and sees some horrifying formations. That could have been the moment anyone would have woken up, says Lacan. But Freud continues dreaming until the end because, says Lacan, he had guts. Well, we know those guts Lacan refers to arise only from the analysand's position that is determined, from a desire to analyze oneself all the way through, which implies forcing and decision. I find a good current example of this question in the testimony of Deborah Rabinovich. She tells us that in one of her first sessions, she told the analyst that she had dreamt of only one image, a white powder, without any relevant association. The analysand does not work that dream in her analysis again for years. It had not gone away from her mind. However, and sometimes it came back, but she could not make any sense of it. Only 2 months before finishing her analysis, the analysand finds something that was revealing in that first dream, thanks to a new dream. I quote, I was sitting with other people in the living room of a house. I see that on my leg at knee level, I have a pimple. So I squeeze it in a very discreet way. To my great surprise and horror, something comes out of it. It's a bug. It's a slug. The association started appearing during that day and in the following ones. In a bar, before going into my session, I had a surprise. The white powder. As a girl, I loved to help my mother with one of her favorite chores. After the rain, we would go out into the garden. She would delicately spread salt over the slugs with a small salt cellar and a tiny silver spoon. I watched them melt under the effects of the white powder. This memory made me feel for the first time and with an enthusiastic emotion that I was approaching the end. I want to finish with this fragment of Deborah Rabinovich's testimony because I think it shows how the analysand goes through the encounter with something horrific to take a step further. Here is the bug. In Freud's case was the rotten formation in Irma's throat. That decision is shaped by the strength of the analysand's desire, but it also takes time. So we are back in the issue of time, a time that is only valid on a one-by-one basis. The time it takes an analysand to go through the experience, and that's why Lacan says, it's possible for a whole psychoanalysis to go by before what might well happen does happen. We've reached the point where we wake up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jorge. A very great transmission. I could comment a lot, but I want to open the floor briefly. I just want to remember that we are going to close in about 5-6 minutes because there's a testimony of the past that is happening online, and many, well, beginning with Jorge and many other participants are going to attend that. So if someone has a pressing comment, question for our great speaker today, this is the time. Meanwhile, they're saying amazing from Marina Veneca. Congratulations to Jorge.
Thank you. Now I see you. I open my screen.
Excellent talk from Renata Teixeira.
Hello, Renata from Miami.
The testimony is in Argentina. Is the first testimony of Carlos Rossi.
Is in Argentina, yes.
In the EOL. It's great talk. Maria Cristina says Maria Cristina Aguirre.
Maria Cristina. Lots of friends.
And a lot to digest and think in what you just presented today.
Yeah, but we have one more meeting. So next meeting will be with Ines Anderson, but maybe we could take some time for talk about this.
Okay.
I would like to comment something about, I wanted to highlight, well, everything, amazing work. Thank you, Jorge. But I love the last part. Well, everything I like, but the last part, especially, because sometimes we don't give importance to the classical, to the transferential unconscious, now more to the real, no? So I want to highlight what you said about that the classical interpretation has not disappeared.
Yeah.
That the work of coding and decoding the unconscious is still an essential tool in the direction of the treatment, no? But then that Lacan says that we need to go further, no? This is, and if not, it can become an endless process, no? And I like when you cited Eric Laurent, that he says that, we have to first decipher the dreams to accompany the analysis, and I love the word unplug, no? To authorize the analysis and to unplug all the possible associations to a dream in order to finally come in a second time once meaning has been made use of and used well to a point outside the meaning. I had the privilege of have the Jorge's work. So, and I like very much when you said about that Lacan says that Freud continued dreaming after the horrifying, formation of the throat of Irma because he had gods. So I think it's important, this courage, no, that we need, and that those gods can arise only from an analysis position that is determined from a desire to analyze oneself all the way through. So go to all the way through, which implies forcing and decision. So I see that this step of requiring gods mentioned by Lacan is needed to reach the point outside meaning that Eric Laurent is talking about. No? So we need to have gods to be determined and decided. And I think the analysts of the school show us how, this determination, and then to go through, and then to have the strength to get to the analysis and desire, and to go all the way. No? So this is what I will try to show a little bit next time with the testimony of Leonardo and other testimonies. Yeah. So I think it was really good. Yeah.
Okay.
I think Anka wanted to say something.
I have a little comment. Like everyone else, I'm very grateful and feel that we will need a bit of time to be able to respond to everything you gave so generously. But I like particularly that towards the end, the remark about this pairing of dreams with a second dream that goes beyond the limit of the first, in a way. And I have seen that both in neurosis and psychosis. And I think that's what's so great about this talk, that is not just something that applies in one part of the work we do. It happens in its own way, regardless of structure. So I think that this is very, very illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you, Anka. Maria Cristina, can you open your mic?
Oh, yes. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So first of all, Jorge, thank you so much. I would love to read this paper. So whenever it's published or any other way, it will be fantastic. There's one sentence I have heard so many times, but really called my attention today. The dream wakes you up at the moment when it's going to reveal its truth. It's the dream that wakes you up. It's not you that wake up. I don't know if you have any idea about this, because generally the idea is that, you know, we are the dreamers, we dream, but the sentence is the dream wakes you up when it's going to reveal the truth. Like there is an agency in the dream itself.
Sorry, I have a problem with I have techniques problems just when you ask me the question. So please tell me again.
Yes. So I was saying that I have heard this sentence many times, but for the first time it, you know, resonated differently. And
Okay.
I don't know if you can say something more.
Okay.
Of the function of the dream as an agent. Because the sentence is, the dream wakes you up when it's going to reveal its truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Your question is the dream wake you up or you wake you up?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, it's true. Who wake you up? Because it's like a defense.
Yes.
No? Like a defense. So the dream don't wake you up. The defense of the unconscious wake you up.
But the sentence, and it's written by Lacan, is the dream wakes you up.
Yes, yes, it's confused. It's confused. Exactly. It's interesting to think. Because the dream has not any any purpose, no? So dreams wake you up. Yeah, a contents of the dream make that you wake up.
Except if you have guts, like in the case of Freud, you continue dreaming.
Yes. But
so it's like there is an opposition there between two things, right?
Yeah.
The dream wakes you up when it's going to reveal its truth, except in the case of Freud with Irma,
yeah,
in which Freud continues dreaming.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like there is an opposition of forces.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, something to think.
Me.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Marcela Ruda from Argentina. What I'm saying is that it's very interesting, the article that Miller wrote that is called, I don't know, Despertar, Awakening, no? And there he says that is the desire of knowledge, I don't know, el deseo de saber, how you translate that. So
the desire to know.
Desire to know. Yes, that is what makes Freud go ahead, because he wants to know.
Yeah.
And so that's why Jorge was saying that whenever you start therapy, is that the fact that you want to know when you go ahead. No, it's the same type of desire, I would say. That's all my comments.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple more of questions. I promised to pass it on to Jorge and to connect for the answers. In any case, we could continue next Saturday. We have another presentation by Ines, Dreams in a Testimony. So thank you very much for your participation, for your comments and questions. Thank you, Jorge, very much for this wonderful presentation, and hope to see you next week. So have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you.